The first protest of the day came not from an alarm clock, but from the vertebrae in his lumbar spine. A low grinding complaint that radiated outward, a familiar language of overstressed cartilage and compressed nerves. L4 and L5, his old nemeses, sending their morning regards with the punctuality of death and taxes. 4 a.m. The numbers on the bedside clock glowed a malevolent red in the oppressive, climate-controlled darkness. Michael Peterson rolled his monumental frame out of bed, a slow, careful pivot learned over thousands of similar mornings. His bare feet, broad and calloused, found the plush, cream-colored carpet with the silence of a practiced intruder, the thick pile swallowing the sound of his weight. The king-sized mattress, a custom-made vessel of opulent comfort he'd paid for but never truly enjoyed, barely registered his departure. It was engineered to isolate motion, a feature Brenda had insisted upon, and it did its job perfectly, leaving her undisturbed in her own sovereign territory of sleep. In its center, his wife Brenda slept on, a portrait of serene detachment, cocooned in a cloud of thousand-thread count Egyptian cotton, and oblivious to the world for at least another 4 hours. Her breathing was a shallow, metronomic whisper, as controlled in sleep as it was in waking life, a still life painted in shades of expensive night cream and apathy. He could smell the cloying, botanical scent of the La Mer she slathered on her face each night, a $500 an ounce promise of eternal youth that seemed to work, or at least held the line against the slow erosion of time more effectively than his own crumbling facade. He moved through the pre-dawn gloom of the master suite without a light, his path memorized, a ghost in the machine of his own life. The layout of the room was a tactile map in his mind, learned not through enjoyment, but through years of cautious navigation in the dark. He was a nocturnal creature in his own home, his day beginning long before the sun's, and his presence tolerated only as long as it remained unobtrusive. He navigated the geography of the room by scent and shadow. To his right, the floral chemical haze of Brenda's vanity, an arsenal of sleek, heavy-bottomed bottles and jars, arranged with geometric precision. It was her command center, a place of daily ritual and self-creation. He could smell the sharp tang of the citrus-based serum she favored, layered over the musky base of a perfume whose name he didn't know, but whose price tag he could guess to the dollar. Each bottle was a tiny silent accusation of his own aging, his own coarseness. To his left, the cavernous walk-in closet, a space larger than the first apartment they had shared. It was a temple to consumerism, meticulously organized by season and color, a library of fabrics and labels. His small corner of flannel shirts, heavy denim, and thermal underwear looked like a patch of stubborn weeds in a meticulously cultivated garden. He pulled on his work uniform, the thick reinforced jeans that felt like armor, the thermal shirt, the wool socks, garments he'd left folded on a lone wooden chair just inside the closet door. They were never allowed to cross the threshold into the bedroom proper, lest their faint, indelible scent of labor contaminate the sterile air. That was the first rule in a long, unwritten treaty of domestic coexistence. His clothes, smelling of honest work, were deemed contaminants in this pristine environment. The true changing room, the real airlock between his two worlds, was the garage. He passed through the heavy, soundproofed oak door that separated the house from the three-car bay, the solid click of the German-engineered latch sounding unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Inside, the air temperature dropped 10 degrees, and the smell shifted from perfume and floor polish to the colder, more mineral scents of concrete, gasoline, and wax. The garage was a shrine to the life he funded, but did not fully inhabit. Under the soft, motion-activated glow of recessed lighting sat Brenda's G-Wagon, a brutish, gleaming black box of German engineering that had never seen a gravel road, its tires perpetually slick with dressing. It was a tank for navigating the treacherous terrain of the country club parking lot and the private school drop-off lane. Beside it, Tisha's white BMW 4 Series convertible, a high school graduation gift that had elicited a brief, camera-ready hug before she'd sped off with her friends, the sound of their shrill laughter echoing back down the long paved driveway. He remembered the look on her face, not joy, but a kind of relieved possession, as if she'd finally acquired a long overdue accessory. And in the third bay, looking humble and utilitarian, was his own Ford F-150. It was meticulously maintained, a testament to his respect for machinery, but it carried an indelible aura, a phantom scent of diesel, sweat, and the city's exhalations that clung to him like a second skin. It smelled like him. It smelled real. On a heavy-duty hook by the door hung his canvas work coat, stiff with age and impregnated with the smells of his trade. He shrugged it on, the familiar weight of strange comfort. This was his armor, his identity. From a small secondary refrigerator, a concession he'd fought for years ago after being told his lunchbox made the prosciutto smell funny. He retrieved his meal for the day. The memory of that argument was still sharp. Brenda's friends had been over, women with sculpted faces and voices that dripped with condescending sweetness. He'd come in, exhausted after a 16-hour shift clearing a backlog after a snowstorm, and had gone to put his lunchbox, with its leftover sandwich and apple core, into the main kitchen's sub-zero behemoth. Brenda had intercepted him with a tight, bright smile. "Michael, darling," she had said, her voice light but her eyes like chips of ice. "Could we not? The girls and I are having charcuterie." He'd stood there, caked in road salt and grime, feeling like a Neanderthal who'd wandered into a showroom. The garage fridge had been delivered the next day. Inside his lunchbox today were 2 ham and cheese sandwiches on white bread, an apple, and a thermos of black coffee, brewed in a simple drip machine next to the garage fridge. It was a stark contrast to the main kitchen's stainless steel vault, perpetually stocked with things like prosciutto, artisanal goat cheese, organic microgreens, and bottles of Pellegrino, items he was implicitly forbidden from touching when he came home from a shift, lest he contaminate their pristine world with his dirty hands. Once, after a grueling 14-hour day in the middle of a heat wave, he'd grabbed a bottle of that sparkling water, the thirst of fire in his throat. Brenda had watched him from the doorway of the living room, her lips a thin, tight line, saying nothing. After he'd finished it and left the kitchen, he'd heard the distinct clink of the glass bottle being dropped not into the sink, but directly into the recycling bin, as if it were radioactive. He had contaminated it merely by touching it. He paused, his hand on the garage door opener, and looked back at the oak door leading into the house. It felt less like an entryway and more like a border checkpoint between 2 hostile nations. For 25 years, this had been the arrangement, a slow, creeping segregation. He'd met Brenda when he was just a young man with more grit than sense, driving the first of 2 second-hand trucks himself. His father, Pop, had left them to him, along with a mountain of debt and a simple philosophy. People will always make trash, Mikey. It's the only business that never goes out of style. Gold, oil, garbage. The things the world runs on. Never be ashamed of what feeds your family. Brenda had been a waitress at a 24-hour diner, with tired eyes that saw past the grease on his hands to the ambition burning behind them. She'd laughed at his jokes, and hadn't flinched when he'd reached for her hand across the sticky diner tabletop. As the business grew, so did her appetite for the life it could provide. 10 trucks bought them a starter home in a decent suburb. 50 trucks, and she wanted the gated community with the golf course. When Peterson Waste Management became the sole sanitation contractor for the entire metropolitan area, a multi-million-dollar corporation, she had their perfectly good house torn down and replaced with this sprawling, ostentatious palace of glass and stone. He'd tried to give up the routes. His accountant, A perpetually stressed man named Arthur presented spreadsheets showing it was ludicrous for the CEO of a nine-figure corporation to be hauling bins. Mike, you're a nine-figure asset, Arthur had pleaded during their last quarterly review. We have insurance policies on you that would choke a horse. What if you slip on some ice? What if you pull a disc? The liability is insane. His doctor showed him MRIs of his spine that looked like a collapsed bridge, tracing the degenerated discs with a red laser pointer. But the sterile, air-conditioned world of boardrooms and conference calls felt like a prison. The growl of the diesel engine at dawn, the rhythmic clang and hydraulic hiss of the truck, the easy foul-mouthed camaraderie of the crews. That was real. It was his penance and his anchor. It was a silent tribute to Pop, who had died on a route, his heart giving out after lifting one too many overloaded cans on a blistering August afternoon. Mike had found him, slumped against the side of his truck, a look of profound surprise on his face. Mike had told Brenda and Tisha it was a union seniority issue, a complex contractual obligation that required him to work a route occasionally. It was a lie they readily accepted because it reinforced the simple, slightly embarrassing narrative they'd constructed for him. Dad, the simple garbage man, the walking, talking, vaguely smelly ATM. Tisha, his daughter. The name itself was a dull ache in his chest, a phantom limb of a love he could no longer feel. He remembered her at 5, her face a sticky mess of cherry popsicle juice, running down the driveway to greet his truck, her pigtails bouncing. She hadn't cared about the smell then. She'd throw her arms around his thick denim-clad legs and scream, "Daddy's home!" He'd lift her, her joyous squeals echoing in the summer air, and carry her inside, leaving a trail of grime on the linoleum floor that a younger, less bitter Brenda would wipe up with a roll of her eyes and a small, tired smile. He remembered teaching her to ride her two-wheeler on that same driveway, his big, rough hands steadying the handlebars, his back screaming in protest as he ran alongside her, refusing to let go until she was balanced and free. "You're holding on too tight, Daddy," she had yelled, her voice a combination of fear and excitement. He had let go and watched her pedal away, wobbling for a moment before finding her balance and speeding off down the sidewalk, a pang of pride and loss so sharp it had taken his breath away. He'd stood there, winded, watching her become her own person, speeding toward a future he was desperately, painfully trying to build for her. Where did that girl go? When did she learn to see his hands not as a source of strength and safety, but as an aesthetic liability? When had Daddy become Dad in that clipped, faintly annoyed tone? She had been replaced by this polished stranger who spoke of optics and curating an experience, phrases she'd picked up at the ruinously expensive liberal arts college he'd paid for. This stranger was marrying a banker named Kyle, a man whose primary calluses were likely from a rowing machine at an exclusive gym, a man who discussed stock portfolios with the same passion Mike's crew discussed football. Tonight was the rehearsal dinner. He had a new suit hanging in the closet, the best one he'd ever owned, a navy Brioni that David, his lawyer, and only real friend, had practically forced him to buy. "You're the father of the bride, Mike. You need to look like you own the place. Which, by the way, you do." He was going to practice walking his little girl down the aisle. The thought had been a tiny flickering candle in the vast, cold darkness of his life. That single moment, he'd told himself, would be the return on his investment, the dividend paid on a lifetime of sweat, pain, and quiet humiliation. The garage door groaned open, its chain rattling in the silent manicured street. The damp, cool air of the coming dawn washed over him, carrying the scent of wet lawns and distant asphalt. He climbed into the F-150, the cab a familiar world unto itself. The engine turned over with a familiar, reassuring rumble. As he pulled away from the sleeping palace, a fortress of solitude built on a mountain of refuse, the loneliness was a physical presence in the cab beside him. He was the ghost in the machine, the silent benefactor whose presence was tolerated but never truly welcomed. But tonight, he would be a father. Tonight, he would be seen. The drive to the depot was a ritual, a transition between his two irreconcilable realities. He watched the city wake in his rearview mirror. The first lights flickered on in modest houses, the homes of people like him, people who rose before the sun to make the world turn. He passed newspaper delivery cars, their doors ajar as drivers tossed rolled up papers onto porches, and bakery vans leaving fragrant trails of warm bread in their wake. It was a secret fraternity of the dawn, a city unseen by the 9-to-5ers and the brunch crowd. He felt a kinship with these solitary travelers that he never felt at the country club Brenda had forced him to join, where the men spoke of golf handicaps and capital gains in hushed, reverent tones. At the depot, the familiar chaos was already in full swing. The yard was a ballet of massive green trucks, their reverse alarms beeping in a discordant symphony against the throaty rumble of idling diesel engines. Men in heavy boots and bright yellow reflective vests shouted greetings over the roar, their laughter echoing off the corrugated metal of the maintenance bays. The air was thick with the smells of diesel, hydraulic fluid, ozone from the arc welders in the repair shop, and strong burnt coffee from the perpetually brewing pot in the break room. It was the smell of industry, of purpose. It was the smell of home. "Morning, boss," shouted Sal, his partner from the old days, a wiry man with a face like a road map of Italy and hands as gnarled as Mike's own. Sal was a foreman now, his back having given out 5 years ago, but he still called Mike boss with a wink, a nod to the fact that Mike was the only CEO in the state who could still field strip a hydraulic lift. "You're looking a little tired. Big night plan?" "Something like that, Sal," Mike grunted, pouring himself a cup of the sludge that passed for coffee. "Hey, Mike, you're looking sharp this morning. Big plans?" another man called out, slapping him on the shoulder with a grease-stained glove. It was Jimmy, a young guy with a kid on the way, and a mortgage that kept him up at night. Mike had co-signed the loan, a fact only he and Jimmy knew. "Daughter's wedding rehearsal," Mike said, forcing a smile that felt foreign on his face. "Ah, the big day. Walking her down the aisle, huh?" Jimmy beamed, his face alight with genuine happiness for him. "Gonna cost you a fortune, but worth every penny, right? Seeing your little girl all grown up. Man, I can't even imagine." "Right," Mike said, the word catching in his throat like a piece of gravel. "Worth every penny." He spent the next 8 hours doing what he always did. He drove his route, the one that snaked through the old industrial park and the working-class neighborhoods on the south side. A route he'd chosen specifically because it was the one Pop had driven for 20 years. The work was brutally physical, a relentless cycle of metal, hydraulics, and heavy lifting. Each dumpster he emptied was a small victory, a tangible act of creating order from chaos. But there was a purity to it. A problem presented itself, a full dumpster, and he solved it. The result was immediate and tangible, an empty dumpster. There was no ambiguity, no optics, no hidden agenda. It was real. He talked with Sal about the failing transmission on Truck 42, diagnosing the problem by the sound of the grinding gears over the phone. He argued with a disgruntled diner owner about an overflowing grease trap, calming the man down and promising an extra pickup. He shared a stale donut with his crew during their 10-minute break, sitting on the curb while they traded crude jokes and complained about their wives. In these hours, he wasn't a ghost. He was Mike. He was the boss. He was a man who did a job. And as the shift ended and he headed home to shower and change for the dinner, the small candle of hope for the evening flickered a little brighter. He had paid his dues for the day. He had earned his place at the table. Now it was time to collect his reward. The restaurant, L'Etoile, was an exercise in weaponized minimalism. White tablecloths so starched they could stand on their own, single orchids in impossibly thin vases, and an ambient hum of self-congratulatory chatter from patrons who looked like they'd been born in Kashmir. Mike felt like a draft horse in a dressage competition. He'd valeted the F-150, enduring the kid's barely concealed smirk as he handed over the keys amidst a sea of Porsches and Teslas. The kid, no older than 20, had looked at the truck, then at Mike's hands, and a flicker of contempt had crossed his face before being replaced by practiced politeness. His Navy suit, custom tailored on the insistence of David, still felt constricting across his shoulders and back, a costume for a role he wasn't sure how to play. He'd spent 20 minutes in his private bathroom in the West Wing, scrubbing his hands with a stiff brush and a special gritty soap David had recommended, a volcanic pumice concoction that smelled of oranges and chemicals. He'd scrubbed until his skin was raw, a painful burning red, but he could still see the faint tattoos of grease and grime etched into the lines of his palms and knuckles, a permanent record of his life's work. Brenda and Tisha moved through the room like sharks in their native waters, their laughter precise and socially calibrated, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Brenda was attached to the arm of Greg, her boyfriend of the last 2 years. Greg was a wealth manager, a man whose teeth were too white, whose tan was too even, and whose cologne preceded him into a room like an advanced scout. He managed the money of women like Brenda, and Mike had long suspected he was slowly, methodically trying to manage his way into Mike's. Greg had moved into the main house 6 months ago, at which point Mike had been relocated to the guest suite in the West Wing, a part of the house so remote it required a separate thermostat. Brenda had framed it as a modern, practical arrangement for everyone's comfort. It was a soft eviction, a bloodless coup. Mike found a spot near the service door, a glass of ice water in his hand, watching the performance. He saw Tisha with Kyle's parents, the Hamiltons, a stiff old money couple who looked at their surroundings with an air of faint disapproval, as if the very act of breathing the same air as strangers was a burden. Mrs. Hamilton wore a pearl necklace so tight it seemed to be actively trying to strangle her. Mr. Hamilton had the soft, unblemished hands of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a pen to sign a check someone else had prepared. Kyle himself was a carbon copy of his father, just with better hair and a more modern suit. He was laughing, a sharp braying sound that set Mike's teeth on edge, as his father made a joke about the wine being passable. Finally, Tisha detached herself from the group, her smile a masterpiece of practiced radiance. She glided toward him, a vision in a silk dress the color of expensive champagne. But her eyes, as she drew closer, were tense. They darted around, checking who might be watching them, a subtle flicker of anxiety that Mike knew all too well. It was the same look she got in high school when he showed up for a parent-teacher conference in his work clothes. "Dad," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that grated on his nerves. "Can we talk?" "Over here, where it's more private." She led him not to an empty table, but to a small, awkward alcove near the restrooms, a pocket of architectural dead space where the staff stored spare chairs and cleaning supplies. The air smelled faintly of bleach and a cheap cherry-scented air freshener. The small candle of hope in his gut began to sputter, starved of oxygen. "So," she began, not meeting his eyes, instead focusing on an invisible piece of lint on her dress. "About the walk down the aisle tomorrow. We've been thinking, Kyle and I, and we're going to make a small adjustment to the plan." Mike's heart began a slow, heavy thud against his ribs, a deep bass drum of dread. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck, the starched collar of his shirt suddenly feeling like a noose. "An adjustment? What kind of adjustment, Tish?" It's about the optics of the whole event," she said, the word optics sounding alien and obscene in her mouth. "The Hamiltons are. Well, you've met them. They're very traditional. The whole wedding has a certain aesthetic we're trying to achieve. Colette, the planner, She calls it classic elegance with a modern sensibility. She finally glanced at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Pity, disgust. He couldn't tell. And you look a little rough, Dad. Your hands. He instinctively clenched his fists, hiding them at his sides, the raw skin stinging. The hands that had paid for the private arts college that taught her the word aesthetic. The hands that had signed the checks for the caterer, the florist, the string quartet, the dress she was wearing. The hands that had built the empire that made her a prize for a family like the Hamiltons. Who wouldn't have given her the time of day if she were the daughter of a simple garbage man? She pushed forward, either oblivious to the chasm opening at their feet or simply determined to cross it. And please don't take this the wrong way, but there's a certain scent. It's not your fault, I know. It's from the job. But it clings. We just think it would present better for the photos and the overall experience if Greg walked me down the aisle. He just fits the picture. He looks the part. The sound in the restaurant, the clinking glasses, the murmured laughter, the soft strains of a jazz trio seemed to warp and fade, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The floor felt unsteady, the patterned carpet swimming before his eyes. He stared at his daughter, this exquisitely crafted stranger, and saw no trace of the little girl with the popsicle-stained face. He saw only Brenda's chilling pragmatism, polished to a mirror shined by a lifetime of effortless privilege, a privilege he had provided, one agonizing, back-breaking day at a time. Greg? The name came out as a dry croak. He's known you for 2 years, Tisha. He sells your mother financial products. I know, but he gets it, she said, as if that were a logical and sufficient explanation. He understands our world. He golfs with Mr. Hamilton. They speak the same language. It's just smoother this way. Please, Dad, don't be difficult. This is my day. I've dreamed about this my entire life. I can't have anything ruin it. A dream he had financed from the ground up. A dream from which he was now being evicted. The suit he was wearing, the dinner they were eating, the life she was living. All of it was a product of the very roughness she found so offensive. You can still be there, obviously, she added quickly. A pathetic, insulting consolation prize tossed to a beggar. We have a seat for you, in the back, so you can watch everything without being in the way, without contaminating the aesthetic, without being seen. The final, brutal truth lay bare. He was the foundation, buried deep underground, essential but unsightly. The money was welcome in the house, but the man who earned it had to use the service entrance. For 25 years, his dirty money had been laundered by the time it hit their credit cards. It arrived scrubbed clean of the stench of its origins, transformed into Chanel No. 5, BMW leather, and first-class tickets to St. Bart's. But he, the man, remained unforgivably, irrevocably stained. He was the garbage man. He didn't know what she expected him to do. To yell, to argue, to plead. He had no script for this. All the fight went out of him, replaced by a profound and terrible silence. The love that had been the engine of his life, the force that pushed him through the pain and the exhaustion, sputtered, coughed, and died. In its place, a vacuum, cold and vast and utterly empty. Okay, he said. The word was a stone, flat and heavy and lifeless. Tisha's face flooded with relief, a relief so complete and instantaneous it was a second, deeper insult. She hadn't been worried about his feelings. She had been worried about a scene. Oh, thank you, Dad. Thank you for understanding. It's just for the best. You'll see. She gave his arm a light, dismissive pat, a gesture one might give a doorman or a piece of furniture. and turned, gliding back toward the warmth and light of her party. She was immediately absorbed back into the fold, laughing at something Kyle's father said, leaving Mike alone in the cold shadows by the restrooms, the smell of cherry bleach filling his lungs. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a statue of a broken man in a suit that no longer fit. He felt the sideways glances of guests passing by, their eyes holding a polite, sterile curiosity. The big, rough-looking man standing by the toilets. He turned and walked, not back to his seat, but toward the exit. He pushed through the heavy glass doors, past the maitre d' who gave him a questioning look, past the valet who started forward before seeing the look on Mike's face and stopping cold. He didn't wait for his truck to be brought around. He just walked out into the cool night air. He walked for blocks, his new expensive dress shoes pinching his feet, the pain a distant, irrelevant signal from a body he no longer felt connected to. His mind was a slideshow of betrayals, large and small, 1,000 paper cuts that had finally bled him dry. Brenda, a week ago, spraying a cloud of Febreze in the hall after he'd walked through from the garage. Tisha, on her 16th birthday, hiding the keys to the used but reliable sedan he'd bought her until her friends had left, so she wouldn't have to admit it came from him. Before crying for a week until Brenda had convinced him to lease her a new luxury car. The endless dinners he had eaten alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of their laughter as they entertained in the formal dining room. The way they spoke to him only when they needed something, their voices sweetening with transactional affection. It had all been a long, slow, methodical erasure of his humanity. They had loved the gift, but despised the giver. He eventually found his way to the multi-level parking garage where he had left his F-150. He climbed into the cab, the familiar scent of worn fabric and faint, honest labor, a strange sort of comfort. He didn't start the engine. He just sat in the oppressive silence of the concrete structure, the only light an intermittent orange glow from a faulty security lamp overhead. He looked down at his hands on the steering wheel, big, gnarled, the knuckles swollen like old tree roots, the nails permanently underlined in black. They were the hands of a man who worked. They were the hands that had built a kingdom for a princess who was ashamed of her king. They were his father's hands. And then, for the first time since Pop died, Michael Peterson wept. It wasn't a loud theatrical grief. It was a silent, convulsive storm that shook his entire body, his broad shoulders heaving with the force of decades of swallowed pain, humiliation, and loneliness. Tears traced clean paths through the day's grime on his weathered cheeks. He cried for the little girl who used to wrap her arms around his leg, for the young wife who had believed in him, for the fool in the mirror who had let himself become invisible in his own home. He cried until his chest was a hollow, aching cavern, and his eyes were burning and dry. He sat in the truck for over an hour as the torrent of grief subsided, leaving behind a strange and unnerving calm. And in that calm, something new began to crystallize. It wasn't rage. Rage was a hot, messy emotion he couldn't afford. This was cold. This was the diamond-hard clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose. He had been a willing accomplice in his own humiliation. He had allowed them to treat him like a mine, extracting the value and leaving a toxic, hollowed-out pit behind. He had honored his father's words. Never be ashamed of what feeds your family. But he had forgotten the second part of the lesson. Have some goddamn self-respect. The transaction was complete. The account was closed. He finally turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, a sound of raw, unrefined power that filled the concrete tomb of the garage. He didn't drive toward the sprawling mansion in the suburbs. He drove downtown, toward the gleaming glass and steel towers that scraped the night sky, monuments to a different kind of power. He used a private key card to access the executive parking garage beneath the tallest of them, the PWM Tower, pulling into a reserved spot marked M. Peterson, CEO. He took the private elevator straight to the penthouse floor. The door slid open into the silent, darkened reception area of Peterson Waste Management's corporate headquarters. The air here was different, cool, filtered, smelling of expensive leather, polished wood, and success. He walked past the wall of mayoral commendations and industry awards, past the intricate scale model of the company's new, fully electric automated fleet, a project he'd personally overseen, and into his office. It was a vast corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the sleeping city. A massive, uncluttered mahogany desk sat in the center like an altar. This was his real throne, the place he came late at night, a few times a month, to sign the documents that kept the empire running. His CFO, a whip-smart woman named Sarah Jenkins, ran the day-to-day operations. She considered his insistence on working a route a charming, if baffling, eccentricity. "It keeps you grounded, Mike," she'd say, "but I'd prefer you grounded in a Gulf Stream." She had no idea it was the only thing that had kept him from shattering. He sank into the plush leather chair, a chair that knew the contours of his aching back far better than any furniture in his house. The exhaustion was bone deep, but his mind was a razor. He swiveled to face the glittering expanse of the city. His city. His trucks were the arteries and veins, clearing the blockages, allowing it to breathe and function. He wasn't a man who smelled like garbage. He was the man who held back the tide of chaos. He picked up the secure line on his desk, its weight solid and real in his hand. He knew the numbers by heart. His first call was to the 24-hour private banking hotline for his personal accounts. "This is Michael Peterson," he said, his voice calm and level. "I need to place an immediate stop payment on a check, number 4451, issued to the Grandview Estates." "Of course, Mr. Peterson. One moment," the professional voice on the other end replied, unfazed by the late hour. A few soft clicks of a keyboard. "The amount is for $100,000, correct?" "That is correct," Mike said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The stop payment has been placed. Is there anything else tonight?" "No, thank you." He hung up and immediately dialed the executive line for his credit card company. "Michael Peterson, account ending in 0017. I need to report 2 supplementary cards as lost and immediately freeze all activity. The cards are under the names Brenda Peterson and Tisha Peterson." "Right away, Mr. Peterson." "We'll cancel those cards and have new ones messengered to your primary address in the morning." "Don't issue new ones," Mike said. "Just cancel the supplementary accounts entirely. Permanently." There was a beat of silence, the first crack in the operator's professional facade. "As you wish, sir." He disconnected the call and leaned back, the leather groaning softly. 2 phone calls, the snip of 2 financial puppet strings. But it wasn't enough. An amputation required anesthetic. But this was an education. The lesson needed to be clear, unambiguous, and delivered with force. His final call was to his lawyer, David Chen. It was almost midnight, but David always answered his private line. "Mike, it's late. Everything okay?" David's voice was thick with sleep, but instantly sharp with concern. David was the only person on earth who knew the full, unvarnished truth of Mike's domestic life. For years, he'd been urging Mike to legally shield his assets. "She's going to take you for everything one day, Mike. She sees you as a utility, not a husband." "It's time, David," Mike said, his voice quiet but unshakable. A long silence stretched over the line as David processed the words. "The King Lear Protocol. Mike, are you absolutely sure? We drafted that as a worst-case scenario. A mutually assured destruction clause. Once this is set in motion, there's no walking it back." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Mike said. "Draw up the papers. the legal separation, the dissolution of the joint accounts, the formal notice of asset allocation. I want a full detailed accounting of every asset held in my name and in the name of the PWM Trust. I want it made explicitly, legally clear that the house, the cars, the club memberships, the entire lifestyle, all of it is a revocable privilege tied to my discretion, and I am revoking it. Okay, Mike, David said, his voice shifting from concerned friend to efficient lawyer. I can have a process server ready. When do you want them delivered? Mike looked out the window. The black of the sky was beginning to soften to a deep bruised purple at the horizon. A new day. Tisha's perfect day. Tomorrow morning, Mike said. Deliver them to the house. Say 10:30. I imagine they'll be in the thick of it then. That's spectacularly brutal, Mike, David said softly, a note of awe in his voice. I had a good teacher, Mike replied, thinking of his daughter's casual cruelty, and hung up the phone. He didn't sleep. He sat in his leather throne and watched the sun rise over his city, a spectacle of orange and pink and gold that he usually only saw reflected in his rearview mirror. He felt a profound lightness, as if a tumor had been excised from his soul. The chronic ache in his back was still there, a familiar companion, but it felt different now. It was just a physical ailment, no longer the somatic manifestation of his servitude. He watched the first of his green trucks begin its lumbering journey through the distant streets, a soldier in his silent army. At 5 a.m. he left the silent headquarters, took the elevator to his F-150 and drove back to the depot. He felt no desire to return to the house on Sycamore Crest Lane. It wasn't his home. It was just a building where his things were. He walked into the break room, poured himself a cup of the famously terrible coffee, and felt a genuine smile spread across his face for the first time in years. Morning, boys, he said to the assembled crew, his voice full and clear. Let's go make the city shine. He climbed into the cab of his usual truck, number 73, an old Mac with a gearbox that had a personality and a clutch that required a strong leg. The vinyl seat was molded to his form. He put the truck in gear, the engine groaning in protest before catching, and pulled out of the depot, leading his fleet of roaring, blinking beasts into the dawn. He was on his regular route. He was a garbage man. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a deep, swelling pride in the fact. The first tremor hit the house on Sycamore Crest Lane at 10:17 a.m. The master suite was a hurricane of frantic activity and expensive perfume. Tisha sat enthroned before a 3-panel mirror, a team of stylists buzzing around her like bees serving their queen. Her hair was a sculpted marvel of curls and strategically placed diamond pins. Her face was a perfect contoured mask of bridal beauty. Brenda, draped in a silk robe with Mother of the Bride embroidered on the back in gold thread, was directing the chaos with the militant precision of a field marshal, snapping at a makeup artist to use less bronzer. She needs to look ethereal, not sunburnt. Greg, her designated aisle walker, lounged on a chaise, sipping champagne and offering vapid encouragement. Stunning, darling. Positively ethereal. He'd already practiced his warm, paternal smile in the mirror, pleased with the gravitas it lent his handsome face. The chaos was pierced by the wedding planner, Colette, who burst into the room without knocking, her face the color of spoiled milk. Her usual unflappable demeanor was gone, replaced by naked panic. Brenda, Tisha, we have a situation, a major situation. What is it, Colette? Brenda snapped, annoyed at the interruption. Did the florist use cream roses instead of ivory? I was very specific. It's the venue, Colette stammered, wringing her hands, her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. The Grandview. They're locked. The manager just called me. He says the payment for the event was canceled this morning. The stop payment order came from the issuing bank. Brenda let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. That's absurd. It's $100,000 check. It's a clerical error. Call Michael. Have him sort it out. That's what he's for. I tried calling the bank, Colette whispered, her voice trembling. They said the order came directly from the primary account holder. At 11:52 p.m. last night, a Mr. Michael Peterson. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hiss of a can of hairspray. Tisha froze, her perfect porcelain mask cracking. Dad, she said, her voice a tiny confused thing. But why would he do that? He was fine last night. He said he understood. Brenda's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. That manipulative son of a bitch. He's throwing a childish tantrum because his feelings got hurt. Get him on the phone. Now. As Tisha scrambled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen, Brenda's own phone began to ring. It was the concierge service for her American Express Black Card, a call she was expecting to confirm the final payment for the champagne. Yes, what is it? She barked into the phone. She listened, her expression shifting from irritation to disbelief to raw panic. What do you mean, declined? It's an unlimited credit line. I just used it yesterday. Try it again. Frozen? On whose authority? She listened for another moment, her jaw going slack. Michael Peterson. Yes, he's my husband. She hung up, the phone slipping from her fingers onto the plush carpet. My card has been canceled. At that precise moment, the grand doorbell chimed through the house, a long, funereal peal. A moment later, the maid appeared at the door, holding a thick manila envelope. For Ms. Brenda Peterson and Ms. Tisha Peterson, she announced timidly, delivered by a courier. Brenda ripped it open. The documents inside were dense with legal jargon. She scanned the cover letter from Chen and Associates. Words and phrases leaped off the page like vipers. Notice of legal separation. Immediate cessation of all non-essential financial support. Revocation of access to all assets, real and liquid, held by the Peterson Waste Management Trust. Attached was a summary of that trust. A portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate so vast it seemed impossible. And at the top of the corporate structure summary, one name, Michael Peterson, sole proprietor, chairman, and CEO. Oh my God, Brenda breathed, sinking onto the edge of the chaise, the papers fluttering to the floor. Greg, read this. Greg, the wealth manager, picked up the documents, his predatory smile finally vanishing as he absorbed the numbers. The scale of it was beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't the nest egg of a high-earning tradesman. This was dynastic wealth. He had been courting the queen of a small province, only to discover she was merely the consort of an emperor he'd never even met. I don't understand, he stammered. He's a garbage man. He lied, Brenda whispered, the truth hitting her with the force of a physical blow. All this time, the bastard lied to us. He wasn't the worker. He was the king. Tisha, her face now a mess of tears and confusion, finally got through to Mike's phone. He was parked on a quiet residential street, the hydraulic arm of his truck paused mid-lift over a dumpster ripe with the smell of discarded flowers from a nearby florist. He saw her name on the screen, took a long, slow breath, and tapped answer. The sound that erupted from the speaker was not a human voice. It was a shriek of pure, distilled entitlement and rage. What did you do? Mike held the phone a few inches from his ear, listening with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. You ruined it. You ruined my wedding. The venue is locked. The cards don't work. How could you do this to me after everything I've done to prepare? He brought the phone back to his ear. The steady, low rumble of his truck's engine was a comforting counterpoint to her hysteria. Tisha, he said. His voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. It was the voice of the CEO, a voice she had never heard before. Don't you Tisha me. You fix this. You call them and you fix this right now. I am getting married today. This is my perfect day. You owe me this perfect day, she sobbed, her words dissolving into incoherent gasps. He owed her nothing. The accounts had been settled in full last night, in a shadowed alcove smelling of disinfectant and disappointment. He let the silence hang in the air, punctuated only by her ragged, desperate breaths. He pictured her there, in the opulent prison he had built for her $10,000 dress now a meaningless costume, the diamond pins in her hair glinting uselessly. Ask Greg to pay for it, Mike said, his voice as cold and clean as polished steel. Since he's walking you down the aisle, he can pay for you. He didn't wait for her response. He pressed the red icon on the screen, ending the call. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The screaming was gone. There was only the rumble of his engine, the sound of his real life. He pulled the lever, and the hydraulic arm lifted the dumpster, emptying its contents with a satisfying, thunderous crash. In the pristine asphalt parking lot of the Grandview Estates, Tisha Peterson stood in her magnificent wedding gown, the phone clattering from her numb fingers onto the ground. Her face was a grotesque parody of the bridal beauty from an hour ago, streaked with black rivers of mascara. Her mother was on her own phone, no longer speaking, but screeching at Greg, who was already backing away toward his car, his face pale, his wealth manager brain frantically calculating his escape from this sudden financial cataclysm. Brenda, this is between you and your husband, he was saying, his voice tight with panic. I can't get involved in this. My firm has a morality clause. The first of the wedding guests were arriving, pulling their luxury cars up to the chained and padlocked gates, their faces a mixture of confusion and morbid curiosity. They slowed down, windows rolling down, phones emerging to capture the bizarre spectacle. The mother of the bride in a silk robe screaming at her fleeing boyfriend, and the bride herself, a vision of ruined elegance. The princess stood before her locked castle, her dream day reduced to a public humiliation. She looked down at her dress, the symbol of her perfect aesthetic, now just an absurdly expensive shroud for her dead fantasy. She sank to the grimy asphalt, the delicate lace and silk dragging in the dirt and oil stains, not caring about the filth. Her body convulsed with sobs of pure, thwarted rage. She was no longer a bride. She was just a girl in a fancy dress, crying in a parking lot, finally understanding the true value of the man she had thrown away like last week's trash. The smell of hot asphalt and exhaust fumes filled her lungs, and for the first time, she thought she could detect another scent on the air. Faint, distant, the smell of garbage, the smell of the foundation of her entire life, now crumbling beneath her. Miles across town, Michael Peterson shifted Truck 73 into gear. The sun was high and bright now, glinting off the windshield. He turned the heavy vehicle, not back toward the depot, but toward the on-ramp for the interstate highway. The road stretched before him, a long gray ribbon of asphalt leading to everywhere else. He rolled down the window, and the wind blasted through the cab, carrying the familiar sense of his life's work. It was the smell of his hands. It was the smell of his labor. It was the smell of his freedom. He gripped the worn steering wheel, his big, rough, capable hands steady and sure, and drove on, a king in his rumbling chariot, finally, blessedly, free.